Hello, I'm Roderick Schrock. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the executive director of Eyebeam. I'd like to describe myself for any guests who are blind or low vision. I have brown and gray hair, cut short but floppy on top of my head, as well as brown and gray stubble on my cheeks and around my lips. I am a white man and have freckles on my face and light skin. I don't wear eyeglasses, but I have thick eyebrows. So before we dive into my conversation with Deana Haggag, I want to share some news with you today. As you may know, Eyebeam has always been led by what our artist communities tell us that they need. This past March, I started holding weekly online forums with our alumni, as well as other communities that we work with. And I asked them, what do you need now? They told me that they need access to other artists for inspiration and critique, funding, and resources from partner organizations in the field that Eyebeam has relationships with. In many ways, last year's events were a symbol crash that awoke us to new possibilities. And as the lines between our lives lived digitally and the persistent racial and economic inequities of the world continue to thin, the role of artists as change agents at scale is more acutely profound and is truly one of inventing. We launched our first distributed digital open call that supported 30 artists from nearly every continent. That's why we're here today. We're celebrating that amazing work. I want you to know that starting this year, we are fully embracing a distributed model of artist fellowships over the next years, working as coalition builders with partner organizations to collectively provide network, funding, and resources and tools for artists to invent a more humane relationship with technology. We expect this to actually expand the amount of resources and tools that we can provide through multiple collaborations with like-minded organizations literally all over the world. And to that end, now I'd like to share that the Ford Foundation's new game-changing multi-year investment in Eyebeam allows us to fully embrace this distributed global fellowship model into this year and far beyond. We have made a lot of friends over the last 21 years, and we're now working closely with them in building this model and building a whole new model, essentially, of artist support that is as radical and revolutionary as the artists that we work with. Eyebeam has always been a connector. Conversations and surveys from our alumni tell us that this is the most valuable resource we provide them. And this spring, we'll be announcing a cutting-edge new format called Fractal Fellowships, wherein each artist cohort will develop a new open call and a new jury for each subsequent group, aiming to support up to triple the number of artists over the next years. And in this way, we're essentially handing the keys of our fellowship to the artists themselves, opening up new opportunities for them to take on the role of gatekeepers. We believe this model will allow us to live our values of openness, invention, and justice more fully, while we empower artists to explore new forms of self-governance in this digital age. The very special encounter with Eyebeam, our beloved flagship residency, is changing, but we will now actually be more in the physical world and more visible via these friendships with venues, spaces, and institutes. And I'd like to share just a few words about my conversation with Deana before we dive in. I've known Deana Haggag for years, since she was at the Contemporary in Baltimore, a groundbreaking nomadic and non-collecting art museum. In addition to her leadership roles, Deana lectures extensively, consults on various art initiatives, contributes to cultural publications, and has taught extensively, as well as serving on the boards of forward-looking art organizations and festivals. Her work as executive director at United States Artists has been an inspiration to me in this last year, particularly with her co-organization of the Artists Relief Fund. In our conversation, we discussed how bringing the values of collaboration and coalition building from an institutional perspective leads to better programs and organizational growth. In many ways, Deana and I both are learning from the artists that we work with and building organizations that are actually modeling the working style of those artists. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to share our conversation in progress.
No one loses when we give artists unrestricted money. Like, no one loses. There is no failure at play, and really just beefing up, helping beef up the field in that way.
So I feel very optimistic right now because I have seen some foundations and some people really begin to understand the necessity of supporting at that level, and for supporting in a way that is fully unrestricted to the organization as well, in our case, so that we do have more space and more to work with as we're doing our work. And as I mentioned to you just a little bit before this call, thanks to the Ford Foundation, Eyebeam now is able to continue this transformation that we started over the past year in terms of a very distributed global fellowship program. And this is a real opportunity for us as an organization to take what we've learned over this last year and continue to build on that. And we're actually becoming less of a residency and more of what we're thinking of as a distributed catalyst and incubator. And I'm really excited to imagine with our community and the communities that we work with what that can look like. And I wonder, do you see shifts in terms of the kind of thinking of the foundations that support you and the kind of coalition building that you've done?
A year ago, or, in March, whenever things started to really shut down in the US, I feel like the best way I can describe it is like there was no lifeguard on duty. Like no one had ever faced or considered something so extreme. And so it really felt like philanthropy and the nonprofit sector and art, there was this like brief moment where it felt like everyone was truly in partnership.
Yeah.
Right. That, we talk about Artist Relief as a coalition of 7 nonprofits, but I think one way we really think about it is it's a coalition of dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of funders, individuals and philanthropic entities, nonprofits, readers, folks in the field like Eyebeam who consulted, like lots of folks pitched in to help make that $22 million relief fund work. It was not just the 7 core partners. And I think that came from a place where everyone just showed up at the table with the thing they knew or the thing they had. And for big philanthropy, I think the thing they showed up with was money and expertise. And there was such a generosity of spirit to help us just move through this as quickly as possible. My hope is that that can retain. My sense is that we are walking into an era where I hope, and I do sense this, that really major foundations understand the power of general operating support, sort of Roddy, the thing you just named, right? That we not only can't take care of our artists, but we can't take care of our staffs. We can't take care of our day-to-day. I think we watched how many presenting orgs and arts organizations get like just shamed publicly over the last year for the treatment of their teams and for the treatment of their audiences. And I think a lot of that is, of course, personality and ego and injustices of all kinds, but a lot of that is also just folks don't have what they need to get their work done in a healthy manner. And I do think that the pandemic is focusing all of us on some general senses of health and wellness.
And I hear you around the kind of urgency of this moment and this kind of window of opportunity that we have. I mean, when I talk to other people in kind of adjacent fields, particularly our mutual friend, Lauren Ruffin, she really expresses to me, given her history of working in DC, that she feels as though there's, about an 18-month window right now for there to be actual policy shifts, cultural shifts that would have to take place to capture this urgency in a way that it can continue to be a positive force going forward. And I find that both very exciting, but absolutely terrifying as well, because I hear you, that momentum does fall away after a while. And I wonder, do you have a sense, given the kind of expansive view you have of the field and the fields and all the areas that you work in, like what is if you had to say, like, what is the one thing that you would like to see change?
I guess, Roddy, I feel lots of different things. I mean, I feel like there's things I wish would happen at an advocacy level that I think would be really important. There are things I wish would happen at a philanthropic level that I think would be really important. There are things that I wish would happen at a peer level. I want to see more coalitions. I want to see more grouped endowments, raised funds. I want to see folks, I know Eyebeam was involved in different iterations of coalitions, but I want to see more of that. I want us to understand that the way we survive this is by taking care of every part of the ecology and every part of the ecosystem of our field. And so I think one tactic we have on the nonprofit side is coalition. It's, we can go further together than faster alone. We can make more salient points to philanthropy if there's more mass to cover, right? I think coalitions are helpful because sometimes, I have a contact, but maybe you do not, or sometimes you have a resource and I do not. And I think it's a way to just group share. And philanthropy and advocacy are all about networks.
Yeah.
It's like, let's not kid ourselves. They're nepotistic networks. And I think coalition building brings more people into the network. And the more people in the network, the faster it shifts, right? And I think that brings me to advocacy and philanthropy. And philanthropy, I want a world where people don't say, I could never get a meeting with that foundation, right? I want it to feel more about thinking strategically about your work and whether or not it aligns with the foundation than feeling like you have to game the system to even get in the door, right? And I think I don't fault philanthropy for that. It's just scarce. All of it's scarce. There's not enough money. There's not enough funders. There's too many nonprofits. And so for me, coalition feels like just one tool in our toolbox to like bulldoze through some of that. And then on the advocacy front, I want to see an advocacy for our field that's actually not entrenched in cultural policy. I don't want to talk about cultural policy. I want to talk about just like policy, period. I want to fight for artists because we care about workers' rights. I want to fight for the field because we care about education. I want to fight for the health and vitality of our many cultural communities because we just generally give a damn about all kinds of policies, healthcare, potable insurance, unemployment. And I think right now, that window that Ruffin is talking about, I feel like we are about to see a mass reform of American legislative policy, right? There's a different kind of Congress happening, different kind of Senate on both sides. We're facing massive catastrophe that we have to rebuild from. And my hope for our field is we don't sequester away to make a cultural plan, and we show up and we advocate and we reform with many other different groups, right? That we show up with the transportation workers lobby, with domestic workers, with all kinds of gig and freelance and dual employment workers, right? Like, I think that to me feels like we as our field is so brilliant at storytelling and so brilliant at proposing ideas and proposing solutions. But I don't think we can just do it to serve and aid ourselves. And I think a lot of cultural communities already operate this way nationally. Artists are not a separate thing from the way that their cultures behave. But I do think the institutions we've all built feel a little bit like we're all over here doing our own thing, when there's really a moment right now where through the power of coalition, through the power of community and partnership, we can just really ride the coattails and help and support other movements that will help artists and cultural workers across the country.
What I'm seeing with the artists that we work with, they're ahead of the game when it comes to that, with that kind of coalition building and with just like an innate understanding of the role that their work plays in the larger society. I mean, there's so many artists that we've both worked with that are really thinking of themselves as artists, but artists in a much more expansive manner than many of the institutions that they work with.
100%.
And so it's always this question of like, then how do these institutions, kind of catch up to this game and catch up to the artists that they're working with? And
I think some things I know our staff is really thinking about is what more could we be doing for each of the artists we work with? And I do think in some ways that is a policy exploration, or that is an advocacy conversation. What are ways, what are things artists need, and where's the momentum to meet those needs if it's outside of our sector, right? So if we're hearing from artists that they really need more potable insurances, who are the groups working on that, and how do we show up and help? And so I do think we are trying to learn more directly from artists. And then lastly, I don't have an answer for it. It's just something that comes up all the time on our staff, and we really wrestle with it. It's just this notion of merit. And how do you do this? How do you preserve, how do you preserve culture for generations to come? How do you reward works that move our nation at a colossal scale? Or reward makers that have decades of work, decades of effort? How do you uplift budding voices, just starting, and you got to get them, you got to hold them so that they can really just like soar here? How do you disadvantage everyone else in service of merit? I don't know. And I think a lot of us are wrestling with it, not just on our team, but other teams. I don't know if Eyebeam, if it's something you all talk about, but
Oh yeah,
it's a struggle and I don't know what to do about it.
yeah.
And I think we're
I
wondering, out
yeah,
loud.
I hear you. And I mean, that's been a conversation we've been having for several years now. I would say this year even more extensively. And I think because we are in this funny place between technology and art, and we have kind of a foot on both sides, it in some ways simplifies, but also compounds those
Yeah.
questions. And so this year, as we continue to experiment, and what better year to experiment than this last year and this year, we're actually going to move to a fellowship model that is where we essentially seed the first round of fellowships, and then each round of fellowships subsequently will be decided by the previous group of fellows. So we're essentially seeding the development of the open call, the decision-making processes, the essentially handing the keys to this fellowship to artists themselves, understanding that we're pretty good at really attracting some incredible thinkers and makers and artists. But at the same time, we're a small team. We're all overworked. We're all,
Yeah.
let's actually allow those who can see into corners and are seeing issues that we just aren't, as a small institution, aren't able to. Let's try seeding that. And we're actually planning to do about 4 or 5 rounds of this, which has been made possible by this Ford Foundation funding that I mentioned. And I think for us, that's one experiment to try and to allow for different forms of gatekeeping, perhaps empowering gatekeepers who have not had that responsibility in the past, and to just sort of see where it takes us.
You just noted that the team at Eyebeam is really small and that there's just, I feel very similar. Like there's not enough, there's just always way more work than there is people. And I don't know how you feel, Roddy, as the person running Eyebeam, but I think I spend more time thinking about our team than I think spending about any other group, my family, myself. Like how do you make this so that the people you care about deeply in your workplace survive and are able to get their work done at such a personally stressful time? To connect that a little bit to artist relief, when we talk about artist relief, we always present it as, well, like USA could do this thing operationally, and Young Arts was good at this thing, and Artadia had expertise here, and MAP was great at this, and Poets could do this. And so it made sense that we all banded together and pushed through. And a lot of that is true. Like bringing 7 different orgs just brings a lot more capacity, right? And so it's like a puzzle. Each piece fits in, and suddenly we have like a mega org, and we can just like blast through stuff. But I think the thing we actually very rarely talk about, and I had never actually really thought about it before you just named this, is we can just have more integrity and we can just problem solve better. And I think it was 7 orgs and a tremendous amount of their staffs. And so I think we would sit there when we would stay up all night, like really just trying to solve for this problem. It was no longer just, our team at USA in our own biases, no matter how much we try. It was no longer, it was this like group of relative collegial strangers coming together, and each of them bringing their vantage point, what they know, what they think, and we could just sit with a problem for a lot longer and take it a lot deeper, like hear new things. It almost felt like, I don't know, maybe the way it feels like to be back in college or something, where you're just like all these new viewpoints. And so I think actually we walked out with a lot more integrity, because there would be someone that you knew, but you hadn't worked with all that closely before, saying it cannot be like this. No. And you were like, oh, whereas in our teams, no matter our politics, no matter how radical we want to be, we end up falling into our own patterns. We know what our colleagues like and dislike. We kind of know how to move around it at this point. But in a crisis with a group of strangers, which is really what we were, many of us have still never met to this day ever in real life. And so it's like, oh, you could just really sit down and say, I can't let this slide. Like we have to find a better way. And then we do. And so I think coalition, back to that, like even just having more heart, more expertise, more values at the table makes better programs, in addition to now having more capacity to actually make those programs happen. And so I think that is not a way I've ever been accustomed to working, because every job I've had for the most part has just been really scrappy in the beginning. You just sort of make it work. But this was different. This was, we had both, we were resourced in every way, integrity and cash. And it worked, you know?
That is so interesting to hear you say. I've never heard that put quite that way, of the kind of values, what's the word, like values challenge that, you know, kind of arises when you start partnering with other organizations. But the second you said that, I was like, wow, I totally get what you're saying. And there have been moments where we as a team have really been forced to kind of rethink our approach when we were in conversation with another organization that was thinking about things differently. And that is that's powerful. That's like, that's the kind of stuff that really shifts internal decision making and
you're doing
language.
it now, right? You're letting the artists do it, right? So it's not just your team anymore. And so it's like a new group who's they're not necessarily gonna get it right or do it better. We don't know that yet, but they're gonna kind of like stress test that thing. And I think it's like what's that business term, value add, except this is like values add. It's like people just have their values. And so you're like, shit, now I actually have to think about this thing. But yeah, it definitely shifts the work. You're like, oh.
It does.
Yeah.
I hear you. And I mean, that's something that I would love to actually hear kind of, that conversation is something I'd love to hear more explicitly addressed by people in organizations like ours, and how that kind of does shift thinking. And it's really fascinating. And I don't know, growth isn't always easy, but it's always good in the long run. And you know, and I see that as only being just a major component of growth, you know, as we all kind of, you know, move forward into this strange new land that we find ourselves called 2021, which boy, talk about a question mark. Yeah, no kidding. Anyway, thanks for taking this time with us today. And
thank you, Eyebeam. It's been Eyebeam's definitely an org that from every vantage point, you can tell that y'all are leaning into this like really hard. So thank you for everybody on your team.
Absolutely. Oh, I mean, and it is the team, and it's an incredible team. And so I really appreciate you saying that. And thank you. And I can't wait to see what you are cooking up next. And it's always great to see you.